A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Laches, The Sacred Band. By Naki. Episode 13, Illyrian Chaff and the Coin. Late autumn, November 368 BC. The tallow candles guttered in their iron rings as a cold draft sliced beneath the heavy oak lintels of the long hall, carrying the damp scent of thawing mud and pine smoke from the Scardu's foothills. Bardylis did not blink as the silver coins rolled across the grease-stained wood. He reached out with 2 fingers, thick, scarred, and warped by 40 years of gripping spear shafts, and pinched a single tetradrachm from the pile. He turned it toward the amber lamplight. The image of the Dardanian mountain god stared back, crude and heavy-browed compared to the delicate, effeminate profiles minted in Athens or Corinth, but it carried a weight that made the Athenian owls look like paper. They call us the broken edge of the world, Bardylis thought, his jaw tightening as the memory of old campaigns flickered behind his eyes, the smell of burning thatch in Lyncestia, the frantic, useless charge of Macedonian horsemen who thought their royal blood could turn a wall of ashwood spears. Let them name us barbarians in their comedies. While their philosophers starve in the agora arguing over the shape of the cosmos, our mince and Damascene hammer out the only truth that ever governed the earth. Iron buys the land, and silver keeps the hand steady on the hilt. Seated a few paces down the board, leaning back into the shadows where the torchlight barely reached, sat Cleitus. At 45, the king's son possessed none of his father's erratic, flashing impatience of youth, having long since hardened into a massive, broad-shouldered pillar of muscle and calculated silence. His thick dark beard was flecked with silver at the temples, and his heavy bronze breastplate was scarred from decades of leading the Dardanian shock infantry through narrow defiles where shields locked and no quarter was given. Cleitus watched the silver coins roll with a heavy, unreadable gaze, resting his large, callous hand over the pommel of his broadsword. My father looks at those coins and sees only the triumph of our minds and the raw defiance of our smiths, Cleitus thought, his chest rising and falling in a slow, measured rhythm as he studied the nervous chieftains across the table. He still believes that a kingdom can be held together by the sheer terror of our pikes and the heavy ring of silver. But silver only buys compliance for a season. If we do not permanently break the lowlander's spine and burn their royal court to ash, these very vassals will turn on us the moment our spears grow dull. A younger chieftain from the Daceretian clans, a man whose bronze breastplate still bore the clean and scratched sheen of a recent inheritance, shifted uncomfortably on the bench across the table. His fingers drummed a nervous tattoo against the horn of his wine cup. The southern passes are quiet for now, great king, the chieftain muttered, glancing sidelong at the dark arched doorway that led out into the freezing night. Word reached the lower camps yesterday, from our runners on the Aragon River. The Macedonian boy, Alexander, is dead, and his brother Perdiccas sits on the throne in Pella. But the couriers from Thebes have been riding hard through the southern valleys day and night. They bring letters sealed in purple wax. If Thebes binds Macedonia to its league, we will not be dealing with a divided border. We will have the whole of the Greek spear wall pressing against our throat. Cleitus let out a low, gravelly scoff from the shadows, his dark eyes fixing upon the nervous chieftain. Let the lowlanders lean on their Greek paper, Cleitus spoke up, his voice cutting through the hall with a deep authoritative resonance that commanded instant attention. The Thebans can send as many ambassadors with purple wax as they please. A man hiding behind a wall of foreign words is still a man waiting to be unhorsed. If Perdiccas thinks a treaty with Epaminondas' captains will save his flocks from our spearmen, he has forgotten how easily Pella burns. Bardylis glanced sidelong at his son, a flicker of grim approval crossing his weather-beaten face. He let out a slow, gravelly breath that smelled of sour wine and roasted meat, and did not look away from the coin in his palm. Let the Thebans send their purple wax, Bardylis echoed, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating through the solid oak of the table until the wine in the cups trembled. Ink rots on papyrus when the mountain rains come. Pelopidas can't trade fancy words with Artaxerxes in Susa until his tongue turns blue, and his little golden-haired king in Pella can wrap himself in Macedonian wool and pretend he's lord of the world. But when the spring grass grows tall enough to hide a peltist, a kingdom is measured by how many spears it can put across a river ford, not by how many scribes it keeps in a palace. The old king slammed the silver coin back onto the table. It bit deep into the grain with a sharp final crack. "Listen to me," Bardylis commanded, his gaze sweeping slowly across the ring of chieftains, holding each man's eyes until they dropped or nodded in grim assent. "The minds of Domitian do not sleep, and neither do our smiths. We are done playing at border raids and collecting loose tribute from frightened bailiffs. Every warrior from the Drin to the Axius will spend this winter oiling his leather and hammering his iron. If Pella wants to crawl back into the lap of Thebes, let them come and ask us for the right to use the roads. Until then, the north belongs to those who can hold the steel." The heavy oak doors of the long hall groaned as the last of the subordinate chieftains filed out into the freezing night, their heads bowed and their minds racing with the weight of the king's decree. Only the royal blood remained by the dying embers of the brazier. Cleitus did not move from his bench, but his heavy gaze drifted toward the arched side entrance where the shadows parted. Stepping out from the gloom came 18-year-old Bardylis the Younger, his shoulders broad and already squared with the confident, restless energy of youth, his fingers unconsciously tracing the hilt of an unblooded hunting sword. Right beside him walked his 15-year-old sister, Audata, her sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the scattered silver coins and the deep gouges left in the table by her grandfather's ring. Unlike the sheltered maidens of the southern Greek city-states, Audata had spent her adolescence riding the rough mountain ridges of Illyria, her hands as familiar with the feather fletching of a hunting bow as they were with wool. Bardylis too stepped forward first, his voice carrying the sharp, impatient ring of youth that chafed against long winters of preparation. "Every winter it is the same story, grandfather," Bardylis the Younger spoke up, his jaw set as he looked down at the silver tetradrachmas. "We gather the tribute, we lock the mountain passes, and we tell our warriors to hammer their iron. But the lowlanders in Pella always crawl back to their alliances, first Athens, now Thebes. Why do we wait for them to come to us? If the north belongs to those who hold the steel, why do we not march down the Axios right now, while their boy king stumbles over his own throne?" Audata stepped up beside her brother, her gaze cooler, more analytical, fixing upon her father Cleitus and her grandfather in turn. "My brother sees only the flash of steel and the glory of a charge," Audata thought, her mind turning over the intricate webs of trade and tribal loyalty that bound the Dardanian Confederation together. "He does not see the empty grain bins if the southern campaign stretched too long, nor does he understand that a kingdom is held together by more than raw fury. But he is right about one thing. If we stay cooped up in these damp highlands, while Pella rebuilds its strength behind Theban walls, our silver will turn to dust." Audata crossed her arms, leaning slightly against the heavy table. "My brother speaks of blood and glory, grandfather. But what of the trade routes through Lyncestia?" she asked, her voice calm and piercingly direct. "If we march south without securing the allegiance of the hill clans beyond the lakes, Perdiccas and his Theban patrons will simply cut our supply lines from the rear. Are we striking at Pella this spring, or are we merely marching our men down to the valleys to watch the rain fall?" King Bardylis turned slowly, his weathered, scarred face breaking into a rare, grim smile as he looked at his grandchildren. He glanced at Cleitus, who gave a slow, approving nod from the shadows. "You have your father's stubbornness, boy, and a sight more caution than your uncle's," Bardylis rumbled, reaching out to cuff his grandson's shoulder with a hand like a blacksmith's anvil. Then his dark eyes shifted to Audata. "And you see the trap before the bait is even laid, little hawk. That is why the north will outlive them all." The old king leaned back, resting his hands upon his belt. "We do not march blindly into the southern mud," Audata, Bardylis commanded, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial register. "When we move this spring, we will not go as raiders looking for cattle. We go to settle the account once and for all. Cleitus will lead the vanguard through the Lyncestian corridor, and you," boy pointed a callous finger at Bardylis too, "will ride with the shock infantry to see how a true Dardanian wall breaks a Macedonian phalanx. Go to your quarters and oil your mail. The winter is over. Athens, salt in the scroll." The salt-laden gales sweeping off the Saronic Gulf whipped against the stone columns of the Stoa, carrying the sharp, familiar reek of pitch, rotting kelp, and unwashed wool from the crowded docks of the Piraeus below. Inside the cavernous frescoed hall, the air was thick with the suffocating heat of 1,000 pressing bodies and the low, collective drone of rising panic. The Athenian assembly had been sitting since dawn, and the shadow of the great bronze owl standing near the dais seemed to mock them. News from Susa had landed like a thunderbolt weeks prior. The great king Artaxerxes had formally sealed his royal decree, recognizing Thebes as the undisputed master of the Greek mainland, while ordering Athens to lay up its fleet and abandon its sovereign claims. Straticles, a senior strategist whose embroidered purple-bordered chiton was rumpled from sleepless nights, leaned heavily over the oak reading table. His fingers clutched a long ink-stained shipping manifest fresh from the Bosporus, his knuckles whitening as he scanned the fluctuating figures. The mainland is already lost to Epaminondas's Phalanx, Straticles thought, his heart hammering a frantic hollow rhythm against his ribs as the roar of the crowd washed over him. If the Boeotians manage to turn their land greed toward the water, or if a single storm traps our grain fleets in the Hellespont, this entire city will starve before the first barley harvest. We are a maritime empire hanging by a hempen rope, and our allies in the Second Athenian League are watching us like wolves waiting for a wounded stag to drop its guard. A heavy hand slammed down onto the table beside him, rattling the clay inkwells and sending a cascade of bronze coins clinking across the flagstones. Callistratus, the most persuasive and fiery orator of the assembly, stepped close, his face flushed with exhaustion and anger. His sharp theatrical eyes darted toward the open doorways where the distant rhythmic thud of mallet on timber echoed up from the naval slipways. The delegates from Chios and Byzantium are rattling their chains again in the lower harbor, Straticles. Callistratus hissed, his voice cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. They hear the rumors coming out of Boeotia. They hear that Thebes is talking of building ships, of challenging our triremes on our own element. If our maritime allies smell weakness, if they think the Second Athenian League is no longer a shield but a liability, they will stop paying their tribute and throw open their ports to Spartan or Theban agents by the next new moon. Straticles slowly raised his head, his weary eyes locking onto his colleague. "Let the islanders rattle their chains," Straticles replied, his voice dropping into a harsh metallic rasp. Chios and Byzantium pay their dues because our triremes protect their merchant bottoms from pirates and Boeotian ambitions. But tribute means nothing if the grain ships don't get through. Look at these ledgers, Callistratus. He stabbed a finger at the Black Sea manifest. 3-week convoys from the Pontus were delayed off Lesbos last week by contrary gales. If the grain stops flowing into the Piraeus, the hungry mob out there in the Nix won't care about league politics or Persian decrees. They will tear down our doors and hang us from the rostra. Across the crowded floor, a younger, radical demagogue leaped onto a mounting block, waving a fresh dispatch scroll and screaming for immediate naval expansion, demanding that Athens launch 15 new triremes into the Aegean before the spring thaw. The crowd erupted into a chaotic roar of overlapping shouts, fear, and aggressive bravado. They screamed for war and new hulls as if triremes grow from the olive trees, Straticles mused bitterly, turning his gaze away from the mob to look out toward the blue, indifferent expanse of the Saronic Gulf where white-capped waves broke against the distant moles. They don't see the silent, crushing weight of our debts, nor do they understand that we are fighting a war on two fronts now. Defending our trade routes from the north, while preserving our soul against a landlocked giant that has somehow learned how to dream of the sea. We cannot afford 50 new hulls, and we cannot afford to look weak, Straticles said firmly, grabbing his stylus and drawing a thick, dark line across the shipping tables. Tell the dockmasters in the Piraeus to double the guards on the grain warehouses, dispatch 2 squadrons to patrol the Hellespont immediately, and summon the League deputies to the Treasury Hall. We will squeeze every last drachma of tribute from our allies if we must. Athens will not drown in her own harbor without a fight. Sparta, shadows of Taygetus. The autumn winds sweeping down the jagged gorges of Taygetus carried no scent of celebration, only the dry, bitter dust of a dying season. Inside the low-ceilinged stone chamber of the royal residence in Sparta, King Agesilaus II sat hunched over a heavy oak table, strewn with wax tablets and census rolls. The single bronze lamp flickered in the draught, casting long skeletal shadows across the aging monarch's face. Despite the official dispatches boasting of the tearless battle that rare, shining summer day where Spartan steel had slaughtered the Arcadians without the loss of a single citizen soldier, the atmosphere in the room felt less like victory and more like an open grave. Agesilaus raised a calloused hand, rubbing his tired eyes as he stared down at the latest agricultural yield reports from the Eurytus Valley. We bled the Arcadians on the mountain passes, and the city rang with praise for our unblemished ranks, Agesilaus thought, a bitter, humorless line cutting across his mouth as he traced the edges of the wax tablet. The young men sing of glory in the mess halls, blind to the arithmetic of ruin. A tactical victory without a strategic foundation is nothing more than a brief stay of execution. Every name scratched off our citizen rolls is permanent, and every acre of fertile soil in Macedonia that now feeds our former slaves is a link tightening around our throat. The heavy timber door creaked open, and Lysander, a senior member of the Ephors, stepped into the flickering light. His face was set in a mask of grim, unyielding anxiety, his sandals scraping softly against the bare stone floor. "The reports from the southern estates have arrived, my king," Lysander said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that seemed to echo off the damp walls. "The Perioikoi communities along the Laconian Gulf are growing restless. They see the Arcadian League swelling with new fortified towns every week, and they know as well as we do that our standing army is a shell. Without the Macedonian helots to work our lands, the agricultural output has plummeted by half. The state granaries will not survive another 2 winters at this rate." Agesilaus did not look up immediately. He picked up a small bronze stylus, tracing the deep empty spaces on the census tablet where whole Spartan family lines had once been recorded before the cataclysm at Leuctra. "We are fighting a ghost war," Agesilaus mused internally, a cold weight settling heavily in his chest. The old world where Sparta dictated the law from the Peloponnese to the Bosporus is gone, buried under the unyielding pikes of Epaminondas and the defiant, sprawling walls of Megalopolis. The Arcadian League hems us in from the north, and our own economy rots from within because we forgot how to survive without stolen labor. The Assembly wants to know what alliances we are forging to counter the Theban hegemony," Lysander continued, stepping closer to the desk and leaning his weight onto the edge of the wood. "They talk of sending another embassy across the sea, perhaps looking to foreign kings for gold or seeking help from the tyrants of Sicily. They refuse to accept that our isolation is absolute." Agesilaus finally lifted his head, his sharp, weathered eyes fixing the effort with cold, unyielding realism. "Gold cannot buy back our lost generations, Lysander, and foreign kings do not pity a power that has already fallen off its pedestal," Agesilaus said, his voice steady and grave, cutting through the silence of the room. "When a wolf is cornered, it does not look across the ocean for rescue. It bares its teeth and protects its den. Tell the Assembly there will be no grand campaigns this winter. We will double the guards along the frontier, ration every grain of barley in the mess halls, and hold this narrow valley with whatever strength we have left." Lysander swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor before meeting the king's eyes once more. "And if the Arcadians push the border during the planting season, my king? Our patrols are stretched thinner than sheepskin. Then we fight where we stand," Agesilaus replied, his hand falling heavily onto the hilt of his short sword. "We survived the tearless battle by the grace of our ancestors and the sheer fury of our discipline. Surviving tomorrow will require something much harder: enduring our own decline without losing our souls. Now leave me. The shadows are lengthening, and the perimeter watch must be inspected. Arcadian League, stones of Megalopolis." The cold mountain wind howled down from the heights of Menelaus, sweeping across the broad, nascent foundations of Megalopolis like a restless ghost. It carried the damp scent of wet lime, quarried stone, and the unmistakable, bitter copper tang of a nation nursing its wounds. Inside the hastily constructed timber and stone assembly hall of the Marii, the air was thick with the breath of hundreds of delegates, the acrid smoke of smoking pitch torches, and a tense, palpable dread. The grand experiment of the Arcadian League, the bold dream of uniting the fractured mountain valleys and independent polis into a single unbreakable federal state, was currently teetering on the razor's edge. At the center of the raised dais stood Lycomedes of Mantinea, his broad shoulders squared, his face carved from stubborn resolve despite the dark, sleepless shadows beneath his eyes. He gripped the edge of the oak speaker's block so tightly, his knuckles shone like polished bone. Before him, the tiered benches were packed with representatives from Tegea, Mantinea, Clitor, and a score of smaller townships, men whose hearts were still heavy with the memory of the tearless battle earlier that summer. where Spartan steel had slaughtered their ranks on the upland passes without losing a single citizen soldier. They are looking at me for a miracle, and I can give them only arithmetic and mortar, Lycomedes thought, his pulse hammering against his ribs as he scanned the murmuring, uneasy crowd. The Spartans proved our citizen levies can still be broken in the open field, and now panic is gnawing at the roots of the League. If the delegates from Tegea and Mantinea lose faith in Megalopolis tonight, our grand confederation will shatter back into bickering tribes, and Agesilaus will pick us apart one valley at a time. The sharp antagonistic voice rang out from the Tegean delegation benches, cutting through the low roar of the hall. "We poured our sons and our silver into this grand federal capital," shouted Thrasybulus, a senior magistrate from Tegea, his face flushed with anger as he pointed an accusing finger toward the southern door. "And what did it buy us on the mountain passes? A bloody, unmitigated disaster. The Spartans crushed our left wing because our men were forced to fight under generals from towns they barely know. If the Mariae cannot protect our borders, Tegea will forge its own defense pacts before the winter frosts lock the passes." A volatile wave of shouting erupted across the hall, delegates leaping to their feet, hurling accusations and slamming their fists against the wooden benches. Lycomedes did not flinch. He raised his hand, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of a battle-tested commander. "Silence!" Lycomedes roared, his deep voice echoing off the timber rafters. "If we unravel now, the Spartan king will not need another tearless battle to enslave us. We lost on the passes not because our men lacked courage, but because we fought as fractured rivals instead of a single unified power." He stepped forward, his eyes sweeping across the hostile faces of the assembly. "They need to see the stone, not just hear the words," Lycomedes told himself, gripping the wooden rail. "They need to understand that Megalopolis is not just a city, it is our shield and our anchor." "Look outside these walls," Lycomedes demanded, pointing toward the unglazed windows overlooking the massive, sprawling construction sites of the new city. "Every block of limestone we drag from the quarries, every foot of trench we dig around this perimeter is a monument to our survival. Sparta relies on a dying, dwindling caste of citizens who cannot replace their dead. We are Arcadia. Every shepherd, every farmer, every free citizen from the Alpheus to the Laconian border is part of our army. We will not abandon the Myria because of a single bloody summer." A heavy, breathless silence settled over the hall as the weight of his words sank into the marrow of the assembly. From the front benches, Aeneas of Stymphalus, a respected military strategist of the League, slowly stood up. His expression was solemn, but his eyes burned with quiet conviction. "Lycomedes speaks hard truths," Aeneas said, his voice carrying clearly across the quieted chamber. "Panic is a luxury we bled dry on the mountain. If Tegea stands alone, Sparta will swallow her by spring. We must reinforce our federal defense pacts, establish permanent border garrisons along the Laconian approaches, and swear an oath that no town in this league will ever treat with Sparta independently again." Slowly, deliberately, the tension in the hall began to shift from terror to grim, collective resolve. Hands began to raise across the benches, first in ones and twos, then in a sweeping wave of unanimous agreement. Lycomedes exhaled a long, shuddering breath, the knot in his chest loosening just a fraction as he looked out across the unified assembly. "We have held the center for tonight," Lycomedes thought, a faint, weary detonation settling into his bones. "The stones of Megalopolis are laid in blood, but they will stand. Now let Agesilaus come. Olympia, echoes of the Altis." The morning mist rolling off the sluggish waters of the Alpheus and Claudius rivers hung heavy over the Altis, wrapping the great bronze statues, the ash altars, and the towering marble pillars of the Temple of Zeus in a shroud of damp, ghostly gray. Just weeks earlier, the sacred grove had vibrated with the deafening roar of tens of thousands of spectators, the thunder of chariot wheels, the clash of naked athletes in the stadium, and the triumphant hymns of Pan-Hellenic glory. Now the grand stadium stood empty and silent, its dirt track pocked with hoofprints and littered with discarded scraps of ribbon and broken clay amphorae. The temporary wooden pavilions and merchant booths erected along the precinct's outer perimeter were being systematically dismantled by teams of laborers, their hammers and saws echoing sharply through the quiet, dew-soaked air. Inside the cool, incense-heavy shadows of the administrative hall, Near the treasury houses, Archidamus, the senior warden and chief archivist of the Illyrian sanctuary, sat at a low cedar desk. Piles of papyrus rolls, wax accounting tablets, and bronze tally slips were strewn across the surface before him. By the flickering light of a single tallow lamp, he methodically checked the incoming tallies of tithes, animal skins, and precious votive offerings dedicated to the Olympian god after the summer games. Archidamus rubbed his tired eyes, letting out a long, weary sigh that rustled the edges of a tax manifest from the Triphilian border. The festival is over, the gold and silver of the visitors are safely locked in the temple vaults, and the crowds have scattered back to their bickering polis, Archidamus thought, his gaze drifting toward the narrow, high window overlooking the silent grove. Yet the silence outside feels less like peace, and more like the holding of breath before a storm. The accounts balance, but our borders do not. Every city-state in the Peloponnese is fracturing, and our sacred neutrality is nothing more than a fragile piece of parchment standing before an oncoming flood. The heavy oak door swung open, and Philon, an influential Illyrian magistrate and member of the Sacred Council, strode into the chamber. His woolen cloak was damp from the river fog, and his face was set in lines of deep, unyielding anxiety. The final inspection of the western pavilions is complete, Archidamus, Philon said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he pulled up a heavy wooden stool and sat across from the archivist. The damages from the Corinthian and Arcadian delegations have been logged, and the priests are finishing the ritual purifications of the altars. But we have more pressing matters than broken tent posts. Archidamus paused, his bronze stylus hovering over the wax tablet. He looked up, meeting the magistrate's grim gaze. The Arcadian League again? Who else? Philon replied bitterly, leaning his weight onto the edge of the desk. The messengers arriving from our border settlements in Triphylia bring worse news by the day. Ever since their defeat at the Tearless battle, the Marii in Megalopolis have been desperate to secure their southern flanks and agricultural supply lines. They look at our fertile borderlands and our traditional jurisdiction over the sanctuary routes with hungry eyes. They talk of federal unity, but what they want is hegemony over the entire Alpheus Valley. Archidamus set the stylus down with a quiet click, the weight of the sanctuary's precarious position settling heavily over his shoulders. For generations, Elis has stood apart from the petty wars of Greece under the divine protection of the Olympian truce, Archidamus mused internally, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. We welcome Spartans, Athenians, Thebans, and Arcadians alike beneath the banner of Zeus. But sacred laws and ancient treaties mean nothing to men with pikes who are fighting for their survival. If the Arcadian League marches west, our neutrality will be trampled into the mud alongside our altars. And what of Sparta? Archidamus asked quietly, his voice measured. Can Argead offer us protection? A harsh, humorless laugh escaped Philon's lips. Sparta is bleeding out behind her own mountains, Archidamus. They are rationing grain in their mess halls and struggling to keep their own Periakoi loyal. They have no armies to spare for Elis. We stand entirely alone. Philon leaned closer, his eyes burning with intense, urgent focus. We must dispatch sacred heralds to the Federal Assembly at Megalopolis before the winter frosts lock the mountain passes. We must remind them of the pan-Hellenic sacred laws, of the terrible curse that falls upon any power that violates the peace of Olympia. Archidamus slowly shook his head, a somber shadow crossing his weathered face. Remind a starving wolf of the laws of the pasture, Philon, and see if it stops its jaws from closing, Archidamus said softly, picking up his stylus once more. Send the heralds by all means. Let us fulfill our sacred duties to the letter. But while you talk of divine curses to the Arcadians, tell our garrison commanders in Triphylia to sharpen their spears and reinforce the border watch. The festival of Zeus has ended. Now we must prepare to defend his home. To be continued in episode 14, Epirus, Echoes of the Oracle. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Heroslachus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.